What we want to do today is we want to continue with that material that we had last time, where we talked about the origin of different kinds of money and how it's evolved over the years. As I mentioned to you last time, money was not originally invented by government, but certainly governments control money in our modern world today. In the United States today, we've got really two main kinds of money, what we call money. And if you remember, for it to be money, it has to be a unit of account and it has to be a medium of exchange. And so we've got a couple of things that serve as money in the United States today. The one kind is currency, which I'll just use this capital C to represent currency. But there's currency. I mean by this term currency both coins and paper notes. So like a $10 bill, that would be currency, but so would a 25-cent piece. Okay? That's one form of currency, and you know, there's not a big mystery where that comes from, is there? We know, or I assume you know where it comes from. The Treasury Department has a mint that stamps out coins, and it's got a Bureau of Engraving and Printing that stamps out the paper notes. So it's really the Treasury Department that manufactures currency in the United States. There's another form of money, which is checking deposits at, and I'll have a little list here, commercial banks, which we normally just call banks, at savings and loans, at mutual savings banks, and at, and I'll just abbreviate that, MSB. That's the stuff the Chinese put in their food that sometimes, you know, gives you trouble. And finally, at credit unions. Okay, and so anyway, checking deposits at these, they just call these depository institutions. By the way, there's one more thing that technically is called money in the United States, and I haven't included it up here. And the reason for that, it's really just too small in terms of its magnitude to pay much attention to. But the other thing is traveler's checks. There's about $8 billion worth of traveler's checks in the United States. And you'd say, well, $8 billion is a lot. And it is a lot from the perspective of an individual, or even from Springfield's point of view. But $8 billion is dwarfed by the amounts that are in these two different categories. With the amount of currency, we're talking way over $400 billion. And with the amount of checking deposits, we're talking of between $600 and $700 billion. And so we're talking hundreds of billions of dollars with these two. And I'm saying traveler's checks, $8 billion. So we kind of leave that out usually. Let me introduce a term. It's the M1 money supply. M1, this is not a MI or an ML, but an M1 money supply. Oftentimes, I just put that little dash in there, but sometimes you see it without it. But the M1 money supply is equal to just what we've written here, currency plus checking deposits. I'm going to use, I'm not just going to spell it out, I'll put DD. And the reason for that DD, we'll call that demand deposits. And this is really kind of a shorthand notation for all these checking deposits. But the idea is the money is available on demand. If you put money in your checking account at the bank, you put $1,000 in the bank and go back next Wednesday at 4 o'clock, that money is payable on demand. You walk into the bank, say, I want that $1,000 out of my checking account, and they're supposed to say, okay, and give it to you. It's on demand. There's time deposits or a savings account, and that's where you put the money in and you pledge to leave it a certain amount of time. But I'm saying that when you put money in a checking account at one of these depository institutions, the understanding you have with them and what the law says is they give the money back when you want it back. And of course you can also write a check, an order to them to pay somebody else. But anyway, now by the way, demand deposits, strictly speaking, are really only the accounts at banks. commercial banks, and they have different names for the checking accounts at these other institutions. So that's what I'm telling you, is I'm sort of, I guess, not being quite as precise as I could be, but this precision in this particular case we don't need. It doesn't help us understand the economy better or the banking system. But technically speaking, there's only demand deposits, the thing we call demand deposit, at a commercial banks, and then these other institutions have their own. They're called now accounts, and then share draft accounts, which I won't ask you that on an exam. I just want you to be familiar with the fact that I am, by using this term demand deposit, I'm sort of taking some liberties. But anyway, the idea is there with the demand deposit, the money is payable on demand. Okay? So anyway, most money in the United States is this kind of money, this checking account kind of money. Today, the M1 money supply is about $1,100 billion, or another way of saying that's 1.1 trillion. Okay, and out of that, there's about $450 billion that's currency, and about $650 billion that's checking deposits. And so the majority of what passes for money in the United States, the stuff that's generally acceptable in payment for goods and services, and that's really what money is. It's whatever can be spent. And so whatever is generally accepted in payment for goods and services, we call it money. That's these things: currency, checking deposits, and traveler's checks, which we're leaving out. Okay? And I'm saying that well over half of the total is the checking account kind of money. So really, what we want to understand is this, and by the way, before I go on, this is a lot of money. If you divide it out by the number of people in the United States, this is about $4,100 per U.S. resident. I was checking my pockets this morning before I came to work and had a little bit less than that $4,100 in my pocket. On the other hand, this $4,100, you shouldn't necessarily expect to see a lot of people with $4,100. This is a simple calculation. It just takes the total amount of money supply outstanding and then divides by the population of the United States. What is it, 270 million or something like that? And so that's where this number comes from. As a matter of fact, all of this money is not held in the United States. Some of this money is held overseas. Some is overseas. And so if that's the case, and that is the case, I heard the Federal Reserve, a couple of Federal Reserve officials talking about this yesterday on television, on C-SPAN, but since a lot of this is held overseas, maybe it doesn't mean much to be dividing by the United States population. You may not know about this, but the topic on television yesterday with the Fed officials talking was dollarization. They were talking about a growing number of countries overseas that were using the dollar as their currency. Panama is one example. That over the years, Panama has not, and I don't mean ever in history, but in recent years, Panama doesn't have its own currency. It uses the United States dollar as its legal tender. And so the point is that as countries do this, and there are more countries that do it around the world, and it's a growing number in recent years, but as countries do this, then the world, the total money supply is a large number, but not all of it's in the United States. So then if it's not all in the United States, we shouldn't expect for each American to have on average $4,100. And also a thing I'd mention to you is your share of that money. Let's say you own some shares of stock in General Motors, and if General Motors had $10 million in its checking account, then you would actually own a little bit of that $10 million. So some of your $4,100 might be there. It's not your $4,100, but the per capita figure. So anyway, here's what's going on. The dollar is used overseas sometimes, and I gave you the example of Panama, and there were a couple other South American countries that are right now considering adopting the dollar. I think maybe Argentina, if I'm not mistaken, but possibly I am mistaken on that. But anyway, some countries are considering using it. Then they will use the dollar as their unit of account to keep track of values and as their medium of exchange to buy things. In some countries like Russia, they still use, and I think I've already mentioned this, they still use their own currency as the medium of exchange, spending money, and as the unit of account to keep track of values, but they use the dollar as their store of value. And the reason they do that is that they have inflation in their own currency and it's driving down the value of that currency. People don't want to store their wealth by holding their home currency. They want to hold others. So there's different things going on around the world, and there's a lot of our money overseas, especially the currency component. Well, let's go back to this. Out of that total M1 money supply, the part that's overseas, most of the overseas stuff is currency. Okay, and not a whole lot in checking deposits. Not a lot of people from Russia come to the United States, establish a checking account, and then, you know, go back to Russia and just kind of mind their own business. They'll keep their accounts and so forth in Russia if there's a checking account. But if they want to hold U.S. dollars, they'll hold cash. There's about, I wrote this number down someplace here, it's $450 billion worth of currency. Out of this $450 billion, over half, you can believe this or not, over half of that $450 billion is out of the United States. I'm going to say about, and nobody knows the exact number because it's hard to survey people around the world, but over half of that, I'm going to say $250 billion is overseas, and so there's only really about $200 billion in the United States. So anyway, it's hard to know about this stuff. But what we do know is this: out of the world total M1 money supply of the U.S. dollars and so forth, about 60% is this checking account money, and only about 40% is the currency. Here's what we want to understand. This is easy. Where does the currency come from? I told you a moment ago, the currency comes from the Treasury Department in Washington. Bureau of Engraving and Printing makes the paper notes. And that's a special kind of paper with linen and cotton in it. So it's not just like the paper you know, you're writing on, taking notes on. But anyway, Bureau of Engraving and Printing prints that, and the Bureau of the Mint prints the coins. And so there's no mystery where that stuff comes from. So I'm saying the 40% of the money supply that is currency, I know where that came from, and I don't need to teach a class on that. Here's the stuff that we want to talk about, the 60%. Where do all those checking accounts come from? Now, if you think about it for just a second, where do you get the money that's in your checking account? Maybe you got a paycheck from somebody. You know, you went to your job, you worked, they gave you a check, you went and deposited in your account, now you got money in your account. Yeah, but they gave you a check, and so there was already some checking account money. Where'd that come from? There is kind of a mystery about this. This is kind of a difficult thing. I mean, if you're just kind of sitting around thinking about it, I don't think the answers are going to come to you. What I want to do is I want to talk with you about this process by which checking account money is created. And that's kind of the mystery stuff, and so we want to talk about that. Before we get started, let's define some terms, and it'll take us a few minutes to do this, but the first one, and we're talking about banking. Let me come back just to make this obvious, if it isn't already to you. This is checking account money. It's deposits at banks and other depository institutions. Okay? So what we need to talk about is banking. The banks are the key to understanding this. And so really what we're going to put up here are some banking concepts as well as some just economic concepts. Here's one: total reserves of banks. TR, total reserves. This is a dollar amount. Okay? Those reserves are dollars, what? Vault cash plus deposits at the Federal Reserve, which, and we haven't gotten to that yet. We'll talk about it more later on. But the Federal Reserve is the Fed. I've used that term a few times this semester, but now we're getting into that section of the course where we're going to talk about banking and monetary policy, and it's the Fed is the Federal Reserve. And I'll come back and give you more details about it later on. But anyway, what are a bank's reserves? These, you know, banks hold reserves, and for sure all bankers know this term. If you haven't heard it, then maybe you'll learn something here. But where are those reserves? It's just all the dollars that are in these two places. If a bank has dollars in the vault, that is to say on the premises, cash drawer or someplace like that, we would say that's part of the bank's reserves. If they have the dollars at the Fed in an account, the Fed won't do business with us directly. We can't put deposits there, but bankers put their deposits at the Fed, and that's their reserve deposits. You put money in the bank's required to hold a reserve, and they'll put it in one of those places. Here's the second term, the required reserve ratio. And I'm going to use the lowercase r to represent the required reserve ratio. This is set by the Fed. And to give you an example, it might be 10%, or in decimals, 0.10. And by the way, that's what the required reserve ratio is in the United States today, is 10%. That's for a medium-sized bank or a big bank. Smaller banks get a break and it's a little bit lower. But what I'm saying to you is this. If you go to a bank today, an average-sized bank, and you walk in and you say, here, I want to deposit this, and you give them, let's say, $100 in cash. I want to put this in my account. That banker will say, okay, and here comes $100, and when that $100 crosses the counter and goes into the cash drawer, that's vault cash. Now that banker's reserves have gone up. Okay, but now the banker says, oh, my reserves went up by $100 that I put in a drawer. And the banker then says, I've got to hold on reserve, must hold, by law, 10% of that, $10. I have to put $10 in a drawer, but I put $100 in. So $90 I didn't have to put in. That's excess reserves. So anyway, here's the total amount of required reserves. RR equals R times DD. And so what we're working with here is this required reserve ratio, like 0.10, 10%, times the total amount in checking deposits at the banks. Okay? And let's say that a bank was holding $1 million in checking deposits of customers. Then the banker would say, well, we've got to hold 10% of $1 million. We've got to hold $100,000 on reserve. So it's required reserves, capital R. By the way, I haven't really mentioned it before, but anytime you see me write down these capital letters like TR, RR, we're talking with the capital letters, those are dollar amounts. And when I write down this lowercase letters, then those are ratios, or a percent, or something like that. Okay? So the way I told this story just a moment ago, you walk into the bank, you make a deposit of $100, the banker says, I've got to hold 10% times $100, my required reserves are $10. Okay? Next term, excess reserves. Again, a capital letter, ER, so that's a dollar amount. That's equal to total reserves minus required reserves. You come to the bank, you put $100 in the bank and a deposit. Their total reserves go up by $100, but their required reserves only went up by $10. We just did the calculation. So their excess reserves are $90. Now, from the point of view of bankers, not from the point of view of everybody in society, but from the point of view of bankers, these are bad. These are real bad. This is about the worst thing you can have if you're a banker. And why is that? And the answer is, because this is money just sitting in the vault or sitting at the Fed, just sitting there doing nothing. And you know what bankers like their money to do? They like that money to work. They like to say, get out there, son, and do something for me. And so what that banker will do is, if there's $90 in this particular case sitting in the vault that doesn't have to be there, earning no interest, just taking a nap, you know, like summer vacation, then what will happen is that banker will say, man, I hate that. I'm going to get that $90 out and put it to work. And so that banker will make a loan. Make it good. Loan. Loan excess reserves. Why? For interest. Now, who cares about interest? And the answer is the owners of the bank. They want profits. Questions about any of this? Okay, got a few more terms, and these additional terms that I'm going to put up are accounting type terms. Things that you would learn in an accounting class. On the other hand, these aren't very complicated. Most everybody can catch on to them. Assets. Assets are things possessed by, owned by. It could be a company, it could be an individual, but it's just something that people or companies, organizations own. Okay? And what we do is we use the dollar value of those assets, and we use our unit of account to keep track of what are those assets worth. For example, if you took my car and my house and my clothes and my computer and everything like that, and you went out and sold it all, then you would have, what, $10,000. That's if it was a good day and people were feeling generous toward me. Okay? Another term, liabilities. Liabilities, what do you owe somebody else? Also, my bad sense of humor is one of my liabilities. But, what do you owe others? And again, in dollar amounts. Let's say if you found out how much I owe everybody else and paid them all off, then I would have to pay them like $80,000. So my assets are far smaller than my liabilities. Anyway, I'm just kidding about what my assets and liabilities are worth. But the point is that liabilities, what we owe others. The difference between these two is net worth or capital. These are different terms. Or wealth. It depends really on who you're doing the accounting for as to what term you use in this particular case. If you're doing accounting for an ordinary business, you might say, oh, our net worth is such and such an amount. If you're doing accounting for a bank, then we would talk about the capital accounts. And if you're doing accounting for an individual, you might mention their wealth. Okay, but the point is that all of these things mean about the same, and here's how we calculate this. Assets minus liabilities equal either net worth or capital or wealth, depending on who you're doing the accounting for. Okay, so if somebody's assets are $10,000, their liabilities are $8,000, then we would subtract the one from the other and we say, oh, look, their net worth is $2,000, or their capital is $2,000, or their wealth is $2,000. Are you with me on that? And here's something I'll just call the fundamental identity of accounting. This is the identity that makes it all work. Assets equal liabilities plus, I'm going to say, what am I going to say? Capital, K. These are all capital letters. They all represent dollar amounts. Why did I use capital? And I told you a moment ago that capital is what the bankers talk about. And well, we're going to be talking about banks. That's what this whole subject is that we're discussing. We want to understand that 60% of the money supply that comes from banks. Well, we're going to do a little accounting for banks here in a second, so I want to use capital. Anyway, here's what I want you to notice. These three lines right here. This is a stronger statement than just something equals something else. These three lines says this must be true by definition. The way things are defined, it's absolutely got to be true. If this number of assets is $10,000 and this number of liabilities is $8,000, the K it just has to be whatever it has to be to make this statement true. This just takes on any value. It'd take on a zero value or $1 zillion or negative $1 trillion, whatever it has to be to make this a true statement. And here that's $2,000. But the point is the way this is defined, the K is flexible. It's determined at the end when we know these other two. Okay? Now, here's what's so important about that fundamental identity of accounting. Is that, and let me write something down. We'll call this a T account. Well, you're learning a lot of new concepts today, aren't you? And here we'll put assets on one side and liabilities plus capital on the other side. Okay. Here's what this fundamental, and you can see that all we've done really is our T account's got the A on the one side and the L plus K on the other, just like our formula had here a moment ago. But here's what this identity does for us. It creates a situation that we call double entry bookkeeping. Because of the fundamental identity of accounting, then we have double entry bookkeeping, which is to say, every transaction, if a bank or an individual or somebody gets involved in a transaction, every single transaction, we've got to record 2 entries for that one transaction. And let me give you an example. Let's say I buy a car and write a check for $10,000. Let's record that transaction. Here we go, minus $10,000 in Tom's DD, my checking account. I've written a check for $10,000 to buy a car. So you see the money left my account, but I get the car plus $10,000 car. And so what I'm saying to you is when we had one transaction, there had to be 2 entries. Suppose it happened a little bit different way, and I'll cross this out, but I won't erase it because I want to leave it there for the purposes of comparison. But suppose something happened like this. I go out and I say, hey, why don't you sell me that car for $10,000? And you say, okay. And I say, but I don't have any money. I'll tell you what I will do is I'll sign a note, an IOU, and pay you back later. And you say, okay. Then here's my T account would look like this, plus $10,000 debt. So now this would be my liability. I've obtained the same car, but I've obtained it in a different way of financing that deal. But again, that one transaction, 2 entries in the account, one is the asset I gained, the car, but the other is the liability or the debt I've incurred. So every single transaction, buying, selling, anything, whatever it is, 2 entries. This is really, and this was developed in Venice in about, I don't know, 1300 AD. We were talking the other day about the early bankers. Well, those early bankers in Venice were developing, and it wasn't just the bankers, it was also the merchants of Venice, which Shakespeare wrote a play about. And you know, Shakespeare didn't actually write that, those plays. But there's a big debate about who did write it. Anyway, in Venice in about 1300 AD, it was a vital economy, very active. There were banks there, but there were also commercial enterprises. They had operations throughout Italy, into Europe, down into northern Africa, Middle East, just all over the place. And to control their far-flung business empires, really the biggest in history in terms of just private businesses. Venice, Genoa, Florence, they had huge businesses during this period, and in order to control their large business activities, they had to develop improved accounting techniques, and they were the ones that came up with double entry bookkeeping. I keep inhaling these markers, and it makes me cough. Anyway, so they developed these new accounting methods, and ever since then, right up until the present time, we use their techniques to do accounting. Anyway, so here's what we have is we've got a little bit of information about the banks and the reserves. Man, maybe I need to go get a drink. And we've got some information about accounting. And now what we want to do is put all this stuff to work. I'm going to have to erase a little, so you can refer to your notes. Here's what we want to do. Let's just pretend, and it's not exactly, it doesn't have, we want to make one other assumption. Assume, maybe not one other assumption, but maybe a couple or 3. One, assume people hold no currency. This is just for the time being. In real life they do, and we'll adjust for that later on. People hold no currency. Assume that banks hold no excess reserves. And this is, again, these are simplifying assumptions to allow us to do what we're getting ready to do a little bit easier. They don't change our conclusions. But the final assumption, assume there's only one bank. Here's what we'll assume. We'll let on like all the banks that are out there are really just branches of, like one bank. In reality, that's not true, but it does not change our conclusions, and it makes the discussion a lot simpler. So we'll make this assumption. Now, let's get the ball rolling. We'll start off this way. Let me just kind of, I don't know if I can draw a picture of this. Assume the Federal Reserve comes flying overhead with a helicopter, beautiful helicopter, and they just throw out, let's say, 10 $100 bills. Throw out $1,000, but just throw them out the window just at random, and they just kind of float to earth and somebody picks them up. Okay? So the Fed, that's our step one. The Fed injects $1,000 into the economy. They've thrown this money out of the helicopter. And the first thing that happens is there's an increase in the M1 money supply equal to $1,000. Boy, you didn't have to go to college in order to learn that much, did you? If the Federal Reserve flies a helicopter overhead and throws out 10 $100 bills, the money supply will go up by $1,000. Ooh, pinch me, that is a real revelation. Step two, deposit the $1,000 at banks. That is to say, the people who pick that money up, we said that they do not want to hold currency. That was one of our assumptions. People will not hold currency. And so the step two is people are going to put that money at the bank. Okay? Now let's put a T account up here. Here's the bank's T account. We'll put, and by the way, I'm going to simplify this. I'm not going to put all their assets and all their liabilities up there. I am only going to record the changes, the new assets and the new liabilities. And I'll put that little delta sign up there to show changes. Plus changes in capital. We're only recording changes, and otherwise I'd have to show all the bank's assets, all of its liabilities. I'm not going to do that. We'll just show new assets and new liabilities. Okay? And here's let's just say one guy picked up all this money. And the guy's name is Bob. For Bob, we'll call it his wealth. Okay. Now, the first transaction where the Fed throws this money out of the helicopter, here's what Bob says. Hey, I got a bunch of $100 bills, cash, and that was an addition to my wealth. I don't owe it to anybody. I'm just $1,000 richer than I used to be. Right? You didn't have to go to college to learn that. Or how do they normally say it? You don't have to be a rocket scientist to understand this. Now the second step, though, is Bob's going to put that money at the bank. So let's record that transaction. Bob says, hey, I want to hand over this $1,000 in cash to the bank, and the banker then gets the $1,000, vault cash. This is really, I shouldn't call it cash when it was that individual. I should call that currency, because that's what it is, you know, that's the official term for it. So anyway, Bob hands $1,000 over to the bank, and the banker takes the $1,000, and then Bob says, hey, you know about that whole idea of double entry bookkeeping? There's another half to this transaction. And the banker says, oh yeah, we forgot. And so then the banker says, we'll put $100 in your $1,000 in your checking account. D.D. Bob. And then for the banker, they say, Bob, we owe you $1,000. D.D. Bob. So that's step one and step two. Let's kind of go back and look and see, well, we've already talked about a little bit of this. What happened as a result of step one? The Fed threw the $1,000 out of the window, and the answer is the money supply went up by $1,000. Right? Increase in the money supply, $1,000. Increase M1 equal $1,000. That's step one. Step two, what happened? Step two, that's when Bob put the $1,000 in his bank account. Now, you know, if we're talking about M1, and we are talking about the M1 money supply, here's all that happened. Bob gave up one kind of M1 money, checking or cash money, and then got another kind of M1 money, checking account money, and so that did not affect the money supply. No change in M1. That was transaction two. And so now we want to go on to step three. We want to see what banks do. Step three. Bank does what? Let's look back over here. And I've already told you now, bankers hold no excess reserves. So let's come back and see what happened to the banker situation. The banker got total reserves of $1,000. I'm going to erase this in a second, but I just want to make some notes here. The banker's got some required reserves of 10%. Did I say 10%? Well, I didn't make up on these. Let's say required reserve ratio is equal to 10%. That'll be our assumption we work with. And so the banker says, oh, I've got to hold $100 on reserve. And so then the banker says, I've got excess reserves of $900. You with me? The banker got a deposit, went in a vault, that's vault cash, it's $1,000, and the banker only has to hold 10% of that $1,000 demand deposit that came into the bank, so the banker's got excess reserves. But we assume that bankers hold no excess reserves. Well, they don't want to. And so what this banker says is, man, I got $900, it's burning a hole in my pocket. What am I going to do with this $900? And about that time, somebody named Sally comes walking into the bank. Sally comes walking into the bank, says, I'd like to see a loan officer. The banker says, come on over here and have a seat. What can I do for you? And Sally says, I want to borrow $900. And the banker says, oh, this is my lucky day. He didn't say that to Sally because he wants to let on like, you know, I can take it or leave it. But inside he's thinking, oh, this is just so wonderful. And so the banker comes on and he says, well, what do you want the $900 for? And she says, oh, I just want to buy some new clothes and things like that. And the banker says, okay, come on in, Sally, fill out this form and we'll process a loan. And a few minutes later he says, we're all done with it. Shake hands. And Sally says, where's my money? And the banker says, 1 second, we'll do the accounts. And so then the banker says, this is for the loan. Let me put a little hash mark through there. And so he says to Sally, okay, Sally, you fill out this IOU. And she does, and the banker adds that over here. It says loan to Sally. This is an asset of the banker. The banker's got Sally's IOU. So it's an asset. To Sally, that is a liability, debt, plus $900 debt to bank. Okay, so the bank gets Sally's note, it's the bank's asset, it's Sally's liability, and then Sally says, where's the rest? And the banker says, oh yeah. Sally, what we're going to do is we're going to put $900 in your checking deposit. Now that you borrowed this money, we're going to put that money in your checking deposit. And Sally says, okay, so for her, that's a $900 asset, demand deposit at the bank. But from the banker's point of view, it's a liability. We've got Sally's money. She can take this anytime she wants. Here's what we wanted to see at this point, and that's the end of that transaction, by the way. That was step 3, bank, loans, $900 to customer. Anyway, let's come back. Here's what I want you to see. Number 1, the banker only lent out the value of its excess reserves. It had $900 in excess reserves. It lent out $900, not a penny more. Okay? And the second thing that I want you to see is for the third transaction, hey, look, there's $900 in checking account money there wasn't a moment ago, that didn't exist a moment ago. Right? You can see it on Sally's books. We can see it on the bank's books. Are you with me? Bob still got his $1,000 at the bank. That was the $1,000 he picked up out on the ground. He made a deposit at the bank. He's still got $1,000 at the bank. So that $1,000 still exists in M1 money supply. But now the banker had some excess reserves from Bob's deposit and made a loan of the excess reserves. And now the money supply has gone up again. Increase in M1 equal to $900. Sally's borrowed that money. What did she want? She wanted some clothes. And so over here we will have Stan, the clothing man who sells clothes, changes in assets, changes in liabilities, plus changes in wealth. And Sally goes to Stan and says, hey Stan, I want to buy some, some dresses, some shoes, whatever from you, and I'll write my check. So then here's what she says, plus $900 worth of clothes. That's her assets, and really her main asset. If you've never met her, you would know that, or if you'd ever met her. So she's got $900 worth of clothing, but then she had to write a check for $900, so that's a reduced checking deposit that she has. Stan, he's got $900 less in clothing because he sold that, $900 of clothing. But he does have another $900 in his checking deposit. And over at the bank, the banker is really, he's the banker for both Sally and Stan. And so here's what the banker says. Sally, we no longer owe you $900, DD Sally. And the reason for that is you wrote a check on that account. But Stan, now you've made a deposit, so we owe you $900. DD Stan. This process continues. The banker now is going to say, oh gosh, we got another $900 coming in that Stan gave us. We've got to hold required reserves 10% of that. We've got to hold $90. But $900 came in. And so if total reserves came in of $900 and we're required to hold $90, then our excess reserves would be, what would that be, $810. And then the bank would make another loan. Just like, where was that previous loan? Bank loans, there we go. The next loan the bank would make would be $810. Increase in M1 equals $810. The banker lends out only the value of excess reserves. Here's what you should see though. Every time the banker makes a loan, and that's what we set out to discuss, where does that checking account money come from? Every time the banker makes a loan, that banker says, hey, I'll put the money in your checking account. And that checking account money is being created along the way when the banker makes a loan. Let's look at this. We got $1,000 when the Fed put $1,000 in the economy. Now another $900, now another $810. We're up to $2,710 already worth of M1 money supply from that original $1,000. And where we are really headed with all this is to say that there is a multiplier. A multiplier effect. That amount of money that the Fed put into the economy gets multiplied many times over in order to determine the money supply. And in this particular case, the multiplier is equal to 1 over R equals 1 over 0.10, 10% reserve requirement, equals 10. That is to say, if we were to just stay here with these T accounts and do one after another of these, we would see the total money supply go from that original $1,000 up to 10 times that amount through the process of bankers making loans. and there would be a creation of new checking account money in the economy, the total money supply go up to $10,000. We'll pick up with that next time. So long.